Can you hear me okay? That's good. A pleasure to speak to you today. My name is Nick McGuire. I lead CCS Insights Enterprise Research. I would expect many of you may not know who we are, so just a brief word on who we are. Hey, Mark, how you doing? We are a digital research consulting and advisory organization made up of industry analysts, roughly about 30 of us from across the world. We're headquartered in London, UK, where I'm based. Apologies for what is a very crap Canadian accent. 20 years in the UK, covering digital workplace and mobility technologies. Occasionally the accent goes off into weird territory. It's not intentional. I'm not trying to be Madonna. So apologies for that if it's a bit weird. Yeah, so and I would say 60-70% of our business is consumer. I joined the business, I was an ex-VP at IDC, and I joined the business in October 2014 to formally lead out our business practice research, or B2B market research, with a large focus around end-user computing and end-user technologies, employees specifically. So basically what I covered, I'm a long-standing mobile analyst, 20 years looking at enterprise mobility, and I've evolved, and we've evolved our coverage to really be that intersection between trends around end-user computing with trends in security and identity, and of course, a major theme is around the apps and cloud productivity stacks that are emerging today as well. So that's really our sweet spot. So what I'm going to do today is kind of give you a point of view as to what we see are the key trends happening around workplace technology today across a range of different topics. I want to look at maturity levels around organizations as to how they're deploying the technology and the business value that they're getting from the technology. I want to talk about what is accelerating maturity, some of the key trends that we see that are moving companies closer to that business value end of the spectrum. And then I also want to talk a little bit about what it means for you, some of the key trends we see over the next 12 months and recommendations to IT organizations. Now, how many of you, just show of hands quickly, how many of you are from IT departments and IT organizations? Okay, half, 3/4, okay. How many of you are from companies that are trying to reach IT audiences? Yeah, okay, so about a half or a third of the market. That's good to know. So what I thought I'd do, Joe, just to begin is to kind of set a little bit of a context. Sorry, that is me. A much younger picture of me, by the way. So what I thought I'd do is I set a little bit of a context as to, okay, well, what's happening on the market? Basically, what we see is that mobile technology and broadly now end-user computing and digital workplace technologies are becoming a core function in IT and a very important mechanism now to drive competitive advantage and broadly digital transformation. Now, of course, this is a massive buzzword that we've heard over the last number of years, but what's interesting over the last 12 to 18 months is that digital transformation is now incorporating employee and workplace views and strategies inside organizations. A large chunk of the discussion around digital transformation in the early days, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, was very much focused around the customer. Mobility was very much the tip of the spear in reaching customers and driving new business models. But we're now seeing a pivot towards looking at the internal side of the house, how the employee experience and how the workplace operates through the use of digital technologies. And that change is a really important one, and it's driven largely by two really important forces. The first is that we're starting to see a much more formalized link between investment maturity in the technology and business performance happening on the other side. So many of you may be familiar with a McKinsey study that was done at the late stages of 2016. They measured what they felt were digitally mature organizations, both from the customer side, but also on the internal side of the house. And they found that companies that were digitally mature had 5x the growth rates of their peers that were less mature in their industries. A MicroStrategy, which is a BI intelligence firm, believes that those employees that access enterprise software on mobile endpoints have a 60% productivity improvement to their colleagues that don't access those same systems. And my most important, and part of what we do as research, we talk to you and your peers and community out there, and we really look at some interesting case studies that are out there. And probably one of the most fascinating and most impactful case study that I've seen very recently was in our neck of the woods in London, with the Metropolitan Police Force. Now, I won't get into the very dynamic political scene that is happening in the UK at the moment, but one thing is very clear is that the police have been underfunded for quite some time, and so they're been tasked to do a lot more with a lot less in terms of funds and funding. They put a lot of investment in mobile technologies. They've equipped a lot of their frontline police officers with mobile tablets, accessing crime reference reports, and be able to access databases literally at the point of crime. That has delivered a performance improvement of 173 minutes per police officer that is out and about. That's almost 3 hours of time savings per police officer. Previously, these officers would have to go back to the office and fill in paperwork, so that's police work versus paperwork. It's a really important KPI that more companies, and that's just in one vertical, that we're starting to see more companies achieve. More on that later. The second stream, which is really important as well, is probably the trend that you guys have seen in your organizations that we've seen over the last number of years, is the fact that digital technology, particularly mobile and SaaS, cloud applications, the actual progression of these technologies are reflecting basically how employees want to compute today. That subjective mix of devices and applications has really been a major trend that we've seen. We call it the era of choice computing because there's a tremendous amount of choice out there for employees to basically conduct new workflows and new business processes using some of these digital SaaS and mobile tools that are out there. The average number of connected devices, as an example, per employee. When we survey employees, they tell us that every year that average device count is growing. 4.1 last year, 3.9 the year before. It's now 4.8 connected devices between personal and between business, and between their personal and business worlds. So that device count, irrespective of trends like BYOD, is actually accelerating per employee on an average basis. 86% of employees tell us that they regularly use apps for work purposes. And a stat that I really love, according to the survey, is that almost half of employees we survey tell us that they see a substantial link between their company's investment in this technology and their individual business performance overall. So really, employees are kind of driving a lot of this, but it's these two combined forces that have made this a really important topic now for IT and workplaces from across the world. But there's a massive caveat to this picture. And that caveat is that we believe, and we talk to you guys, we talk to many companies worldwide, we think companies are still at a very immature stage of development with their actual strategic deployment of a lot of this digital workplace technology. And that is because maturity, in our view, is not just about technology investment and competency, and we've heard a ton about technology at this event. It's been a phenomenal event to see, the progression of technology. But where companies are really stuck at the moment is around the people and processes, around the organizational change areas and the change management areas in terms of deploying this technology. I was speaking to one large oil and gas organization, a big global organization, head of IT workplace in their business. He individually calls individuals in his IT department colleagues, but also in the lines of business. There is a demographic, what he calls as change terrorists. So individuals that actually resist the change of new ways of working, rolling out new technologies. A really important stat that I found very recently was from a big rail company who told me that they actually budget now for their new mobile projects around workplace. 75% of the budget is going to change management. 25% is actually going to technology. That is the inverse of every single, how they've budgeted IT projects in the past, where it was 25% change management, 75% technology. Things like communicating these new technologies to the employees. How do you train perhaps even generational workers that are unfamiliar with the use of some of these tools? I know we talk a lot about how easy the experience is, but there is still that training and that effort that needs to happen in handholding, that needs to happen oftentimes in some of these organizations. And of course, how do you get leadership on board? How does the CIO down? If they're using the technology, that's a very important mechanism to drive adoption inside the business. So maturity is a very linear stage of progression we see. Companies start oftentimes in this kind of foundational phase where they're dealing with changes around the endpoints, new operating systems coming in. You're going to hear a bit from me about some of these new modern operating systems in a later stage. But more importantly, how are they setting governance around a very heterogeneous mix of policies, of user profiles, and of course endpoints and operating systems inside their organizations. What we've seen, and I'll come to this in a minute, is a real massive trend over the last number of years in apps, and that has brought organizations to kind of rethink their security paradigm and their security model in terms of how they handle multiple apps and usage across SaaS. And of course, responding to employee requests for mobile applications has gotten them into building out competencies around mobile applications inside their organizations. And then lastly, most importantly, in this next phase of maturity, we absolutely absolutely see really important organizational changes that happen in this phase of maturity for companies. And part of the big change that we see is we start to see companies breaking down those traditional silos inside their IT departments, particularly those silos between desktop and mobile, and companies start to converge the operations in those divisions. More on that in a second. But the last stream, and I would say just a tip of the iceberg, companies are focused on perhaps, kind of move through these phases of progression in the market and are now focusing on some of these more bigger ticket challenges inside their organizations. How do they modernize back-end systems? How do they do microservices and APIs? Apogee, obviously a big topic of discussion here at this event today and yesterday. How do they drive more automation into their organization, particularly configuration and management? There is very much a trend going towards driving more automation into that space, particularly from very manual or very heavy-handed processes. And that's freeing up time for organizations and IT departments to actually change their role, be more frontline driven, more working with the business and users, driving new experiences for their organizations. I would say the most important aspect, though, of companies that are really mature and are really achieving value from this technology is the fact that they measure. So the bean counters in their organizations have a much clearer idea as to the value that this technology is giving them. Now, this is not just about adoption, and adoption is a really important metric for many companies today. It's also about other KPIs. Now, I was speaking to the CTO of Ericsson, big global infrastructure provider very recently, runs digital workplace for that organization. He said that they talk a ton internally about the value of a minute in their organization. How do you improve the value of a minute? What they did, funnily enough, is they actually quantified it. So they looked at and they measured what the value of a minute is to the Ericsson organization worldwide. A mixture of operational cost and revenue growth. They calculated it was 4 billion euros. Is the value of a minute on average to their organization. They had employees that took 8 minutes to boot up a PC and log into the corporate network to access a workflow system inside their organization. So that is the framework for some of these companies as to how they're looking at measuring this stuff. And it's not going to necessarily be universal for all companies. I would say the last thing that's quite a trend we see emerging here as well is user experience. So how does IT departments and certainly end user computing divisions, do they start getting measured on employee satisfaction, employee experience? I've been speaking to one company who actually has set up a VP of employee experience inside their IT department. Such is the trend there. And if you talk to some of the big PC manufacturers out there, they absolutely see a proportion of their companies buying PCs with an IT department that has a KPI attached to it around employee experience. A small proportion, but it's growing overall. So the market is very much, in our opinion, moving from these phases, but most companies are in these kind of traditional 1 or 2 phases of maturity at this stage. Literally about, the majority of the market is in this kind of phase 1, phase 2. The question that I get is, how do you accelerate? How do you move from phase 1 to phase 3? If the average timeline for a slow organization, say, or an average organization, say, is a 3 to 5 year, a really fast organization can potentially do it in under 3 years. What are the characteristics that move you? Now, there's a whole host of topics here around culture and leadership that I won't go into. I think formalization around the cloud is a really important one, around the speed at which you can move when you're formalizing the cloud. But I'm going to cover 3 really important technology trends that we think are going to accelerate maturity along this curve over the next 12 to 18 months. And these are reflective of what is going on out there in the market around mobile, end-user computing, and digital workplace. I'm going to talk about apps and productivity. I'm going to talk about security trends and how that's shifting to much more of an automation model. And I'm going to talk about, lastly, the way in which operating systems, particularly in the PC space, are changing, and they're driving some of those organizational changes that I was talking to you about earlier inside companies. So the first is around apps and productivity. I think it's a fascinating thing. This is kind of the here and now, perhaps over the last couple of years. If you look at the major mobile app stores, Play or even Apple App Store, if you look at the actual characteristics of what's going on in those app stores, business apps now are the #2 most popular app category. behind games. So there's roughly about 375,000 business SaaS apps, mobile SaaS apps sitting in these app stores. Now, obviously not all of those are going to be employee applications. Some of those are B2B2C applications, but the trend has been we've seen a significant growth of employee applications populating into those app stores. And this is now translating at the consumption level inside companies, okay? I mentioned to you earlier that 86% of employees regularly use apps specifically for work purposes. I would say about half of that base has a very high dependency on apps to conduct their day-to-day workflows overall. When we ask employees, okay, well, how many apps do you use to conduct your work on a day-to-day basis? The average is roughly about 6.1. That is growing 30% year on year. It's about 20-odd% of the average total for applications in the consumer world today. So 20-odd% going into to business. And when you look at the average apps that employees use, it is a phenomenal trend across a whole stack of business productivity, collaboration, social chat, and messaging applications. There is absolutely a long tail emerging, but in our view, there is no better emblem of what is going on in the digital workplace today, in the digital workplace industry today, than this particular slide. It is a tremendous, tremendous array of different applications being utilized. Now, what's interesting, and I didn't have time to show you the most recent data, this came out at the end of last year, okay? We've just literally got data back within the last couple of days. I didn't have time to put it in, but we've seen G Suite shoot right up to be the 4th most popular app in this category, alongside Dropbox, Office 365, and WhatsApp. WhatsApp is absolutely skyrocketed over the last. I'm seeing a lot of nods because it's a very, very classic problem, particularly for a lot of the banks that are struggling with WhatsApp management today overall. And so you're seeing quite a significant trend that is happening around this. The obvious question, and I'm sure you guys are thinking this, is this kind of an IT formalized provision model that you see? Or is this a very distributed, employee-driven, not necessarily shadow model, but certainly employee-driven model? And I think most of you know the answer to that question. But what's interesting is when you ask employees, and to understand that relationship that they have with their organization, just to kind of build this out for you. So when we ask employees, say, okay, well, given that, how many of you have asked your IT department for an app? And 71% obviously have said no. Does anyone want to guess as to the main reason why employees believe that their IT department would say no? Anyone want to guess? What's that? Security is one, yes. The main reason is that IT would just ignore their request. Okay, so 72% have not asked their IT department for an app because there's a belief that the IT would say no or ignore what their request is. Over half of employees don't really have a process or a policy or a formalized program to request applications. And close to 70% of employees tell us that there's actually no place to go. There's not a portal, there's not a reference guide, there's certainly not an app store that they can go in and then get recommended apps from their IT department and their IT organization. So the answer to that question, I'm sure you all know, is employees are moving much faster ahead of the organization in creating a workplace experience that's unique to themselves, that takes into account a lot of these cloud mobile trends, driven by this concept of cloud worker that Google have talked quite a lot about at this event, which we completely agree with. Nowhere is this more evident, by the way, and sorry, I should say, make this point as well, is that this also reflects a fair bit of frustration that exists out there with employees in terms of their organization's capacity to deliver workplace technology that meets their requirements. I would say 20% of these have a high dissatisfaction in terms of the technology that they're getting provisioned inside their organization overall. Nowhere, by the way, is this more evident than we look at spending. So when we ask you guys across the world, Europe and the US, where is most of the spending on a lot of these SaaS tools and mobile tools happening? It's not happening at the IT level. It's happening into the lines of business, okay? 70-odd% of spending, according to IT, is happening around some of these tools in the lines of business. So it's created a situation where you've now starting to see the emergence of these functional, task-specific, domain or departmental specific applications that are now starting to get more popular Okay, the job of these companies is to sell through IT, not to IT. They need a critical mass of users inside organizations first before they can actually come back to IT and say, look, let's standardize on this tool. I was speaking to a bank fairly recently. They were worried about this. They found 160 of these SaaS applications being utilized across their business. It was a big concern for them. And some of these tools like Slack is a good example where it hits 1,000 users before some IT departments even pay attention to that tool being utilized inside their organization overall. So this is creating a situation really where it's creating a set of siloed stovepipes of data inside organizations, and companies, particularly security, are getting very nervous as to how they control, have visibility, and manage this environment on an ongoing basis. And that leads me nicely to the second major accelerator that I want to talk to you about, and that's trends around security. If the apps and productivity market driven by employees was very much the trend over the last couple of years, the trend from today forward is absolutely around security. We're seeing much more attention being paid here, and of course it's been a massive theme here at Cloud Next. I want to talk very quickly, though, as to why it's important. I think there's 3 key reasons as to why this has become absolutely critical for companies. The first, of course, is just general skills and manpower. I think companies aren't yet staffed up and don't have the skills in certainly security and cybersecurity, nor do they have the right technology tools to be able to address a lot of those risks around security in this kind of new mobile cloud era that I'm painting for you here today. The second piece is certainly relevant in my world, but for all global companies, is the shifts that we've seen in compliance. With the EU GDPR, a big one where it requires 72 hours literally before you have to detect and report a breach. That compliance shift has focused a lot of attention on the right tools and technologies that companies have. And the last one is perhaps the most important, and that is just the sheer complexity of the security landscape, both internally and externally inside organizations. So if you talk to apparently the average number of security products in a very large organization is close to 60 different security products, close to 30-odd different vendors companies have on average in their security ecosystem. There's over thousands of cybersecurity companies now trying to pitch products to IT departments. It's too complicated for companies. The other piece, and perhaps the piece that gets all the headlines around complexity, is the sheer sophistication that is happening out there in terms of the attacks. I won't kind of set alarm bells, but I think coming back to the end-user computing space, NotPetya, which was a big attack you may have been familiar with, that hit the Ukraine through the DevOps area of the Ukrainian government. That was a breach that actually wiped 45,000 PCs in 40 seconds. It really, really hit hard many organizations. Maersk, which is a big global company, was public and said they lost close to 300 million as a result. They were down for 10 days as a result of that breach overall. So it's really, really focusing a lot of attention. Now, what's interesting coming back to mobile and the endpoint space is that, obviously many attacks, 90% or so start on the endpoint. And mobile is kind of, to an extent, dodged a bullet. But now I think companies are seeing with the rise of phishing attacks, seeing phishing attacks hitting SMS messages, where employees can easily click on an SMS message, that profile can be downloaded onto the device, and that can sniff credentials, logging into email systems and collaboration suites, that I think companies are now starting to pay much more attention to the use cases around mobile as it pertains to that broader security environment as well. So that's why when we ask you, what are your priorities for investment in this market? Security now is the absolute top of the list. We've seen a shift. 2 years ago it was about experience. It was about bring your own device. It was about enterprise mobility management. It was about some of the productivity applications. They still are relevant, but security has really shot up. And security is not just about endpoint. I think companies are looking at really where data goes, and they're looking holistically across both the endpoint applications and the network. And that's why you're seeing these areas prioritized in terms of how companies build out the new security model for their next generation digital workplace. Now, this has created a really interesting paradigm in terms of the market dynamics that's happening out there around workplace security and workplace technology security. What it means is that basically companies are now starting to look at much more of a fit-for-purpose security model for the mobile cloud era. You know, I've more or less showed you the evidence as to how employees are computing today, and organizations are needing to catch up and create the right security model for that. Part of this notion, of course, is going to the cloud. And one thing we have seen is a really interesting flip that's happened over the last number of years, where once 2-3 years ago, organizations were avoiding the cloud because of security concerns, and now they're going to the cloud because of those security concerns. And that is a really important change so they can take advantage of a lot of these technologies. The other piece that's changed is the notion that the perimeter sits at the network and at the infrastructure level. I think what we're seeing is the padlock, if you like, is moving much more closer to the employee and to the identity of the employee. And that is why we're starting to see a lot of these categories now converge, whether it be identity and unified endpoint management and mobile device management and PC management, whether it be cloud applications. These technologies now are coming together. What's crucial, though, and what is a big trend we've seen in the security market, is that companies can't have these cobbled together point solutions that have no visibility across this stack. So what is also trending is companies needing telemetry and analytics that run right across a number of these different point solutions as a result of that. And that is a trend that is driving, we think is going to drive consolidation. We think it's also going to push a lot of companies to the cloud vendors. We'll come to that in a minute in the future as well. So it's the upper tier layers of this stack, of this modern security stack, that we think is where a lot of the action is going to be over the next 2 to 3 years in the market around workplace and end user security. And part of what is also going to drive that, in our opinion, is that top tier. We're going to see companies, I mentioned to you earlier about the operational challenges companies have around security, and companies are really trying to see if they can actually push more automation into those environments and use machine learning to actually automate some of the mundane procedures, whether it be configuration and management, or more importantly, whether it be looking at threat vulnerabilities and security threats inside their organization. So I know you've heard a lot about artificial intelligence, and I won't overdo that, and obviously this is the place to be, to hear a lot about trends in artificial intelligence. But one area that you don't hear much about in AI is when we ask you, what are your top use cases, enterprises, what are their top use cases for artificial intelligence and machine learning? Cybersecurity is the top area where we're seeing much more interest and convergence in terms of the use cases. So that trend towards converging AI and cybersecurity is very, very real and very, very important for companies. Part of it is obviously so that they can look and be more intelligent about the risks that are out there, whether they can assess whether it is a targeted attack versus just an anomaly attack. They can assess whether they can look at behavior, and they can understand better about individual activities, logging into various different systems, and they can provide responses to that. But it's also about IT organizations just having the right tools to cope. Because frankly, at the moment, it's very, very difficult for many, many companies. In the UK, I should say, just one more final anecdote. So GCHQ, which is our cyber intelligence, which is our intelligence organization in the UK. For their cyber intelligence, they cannot find individuals. So they've now had to take out TV adverts. And so if you go to the Tube in London, you'll see adverts for our GCHQ, which is our intelligence agency, because there's just not enough staff to find in cybersecurity in the moment as a result. So we're going to see more of that into this space. So this is bringing a really interesting trend towards, okay, well, who are going to be the cybersecurity companies of tomorrow? Who are going to be the leaders in workplace security? Because in the past, we've seen a lot of the traditional security companies dominate into that space. But when we ask you guys, who do you see as leading the advancement in artificial intelligence in the workplace? It is the cloud vendors, and it's certainly Microsoft and Google. Of course, a lot of you don't know, but it's the cloud vendors that are actually in the driver's seat in this space. We believe, by the way, that the cybersecurity companies of the future are going to be the cloud companies. You've seen quite a significant investment from Google here. I wouldn't just say it's Google. We've got Google and you've got Chronicle coming into the equation down the road. I think the assets at their disposal, and plus the combination of how we're seeing a convergence between security and AI happening is going to drive more motion into the cloud vendors overall. So we'll see. Stay tuned to see how this pans out. But it's absolutely a longer-term trend we see in workplace end-user security. The last stream I want to cover, and is perhaps the most interesting for all of us here today, is in terms of advancing maturity, is the trends we see around the endpoint and the operating systems themselves. And this is breeding organizational change that I talked to you about earlier, between those traditional silos in IT coming down. If you look at mobility as a case study, if we've asked over the years, where in your IT organization does mobility sit? And it's highly fragmented across a range of different organizations, and also within a range of different constituencies within IT. It could be in messaging and collaboration, it could be in security. For the most part, it's in IT infrastructure at this stage. But what's interesting is that it's not in desktop and PC in terms of a minority of companies. When we ask companies to say, okay, looking 3 years out and the trends that you see happening in end user computing, where do you feel this is going to reside? And close to 90% of companies believe that mobility is going to converge with desktop operations over the next three to 5 years. Now, we think that they were a bit ambitious on this because there's still a lot of companies. I was with a big, large aerospace company last week. I was speaking to a guy whose title is head of non-Windows devices. So, they've got Windows devices and they've got non-Windows devices inside their organization. And of course, a lot of the banks as well are going to take some time on this. But we think the trajectory is correct, that there is going to be significant changes. Typically, mobility has evolved to the extent where we're starting to see mobile teams take ownership because of their management and the cloud-based management principles that they use around mobility. We're starting to see mobile operations team taking a little bit more formalized ownership of desktops. And it's usually some of the newer systems that are coming in that is driving this. So the big driver we see of this picture, this organizational change, which is really important for companies that want to achieve value from mobility, is the changes that we're seeing now in the operating systems themselves. And particularly cloud-based operating systems, we're seeing such an important trend. It's interesting, you heard from Google this week that Chromebooks grew 175% year on year. This last quarter was the first quarter in 6 years where the PC market grew. In the commercial enterprise market, we've seen roughly about a 15 to 20% growth into that space. So companies are moving very quickly, and we're starting to see an uptick in this market as a result of really what we see as 4 key drivers of these changes that are happening in and around the PC and end user computing space. So the first key driver as to why we're seeing growth in the PC space is really just legacy. Okay, we estimate there's roughly about 300 million PCs in the enterprise globally that are over 5 years old. Okay, so that legacy is going to shift. Microsoft, our colleagues in Redmond, have said that they're going to end of life Windows 7 support in January 2020. And what we've seen now in the last 6 months, 12 months, is a real shift now. Companies getting ahead of that deadline and looking much more at redesigning their modern redesign their computing environments to support some of these more modern systems. The second piece that's linked to that as to why we're seeing a growth in the PC space is linked to this is the security model, right? So I mentioned to you earlier about companies paying a lot of attention to security. WannaCry was a very important attack that hit globally, but it took down significant portions of the NHS in the UK. The weakness was an unpatched PC. So it's a security vulnerability overall for many companies, and I think companies are starting to take that seriously. And when you move to some of these more modern systems, particularly those that are wrapped around the cloud, companies are taking advantage of much tighter security, whether that is the constant flow of patches and updates. And I know some devices, including Chromebooks, they have 90-odd% percent of the devices that are in field are on the latest version of that operating system. So our IT organizations don't have to spend their lives worrying about outdated patches, and they can focus more importantly on some of the more business risk areas inside their organizations. The other piece that's really important around the kind of drive towards changes in the PC operating system space is around cost, right? So what we see with some of these newer systems is particularly the total cost of ownership of the management model can be cheaper, roughly 40% cheaper than traditional systems or PC management. This means that companies have to embrace cloud-based management tools, but more importantly, shift that paradigm of the traditional PC management model, which is very domain joined, to move it to much more of a user authenticated architecture, which I've highlighted earlier as well. So that shift is also a mindset and strategic shift for companies as well. So cost is a very important one. Also, some of the life cycle, the performance improvements of these devices improves the life cycle of these devices quite significantly as well. Some devices that can go into field more than 4 or 5 years, and companies are taking advantage of that as well. And then the last piece I would say that's really important, and it's related to more specifically to Chrome, is that companies are now looking at different use cases. So they're not just looking at their traditional employees or white-collar knowledge workers or cloud workers. They're also looking at other use cases, shared devices, kiosks, field service individuals, single-purpose devices. And the flexibility of some of these platforms to be deployed in some of those use cases is also a reason why we're starting to see a growth into the PC market as well. So this all in means that we see that shift in terms of the phases of maturity and companies moving to business value. The trends here really do believe are about how IT can also embrace some of these systems, change the operating model, break down those traditional silos, and then shift the role of IT much more closer to the business and users as a result. So what does all this mean? I think it really what I want to kind of leave you with kind of 3 to 4 key areas as to what we're going to see over the next 12 to 18 months. The top one is that this is now a priority. Digital transformation over the last number of years has been largely concentrated around the customer experience and the business model changes that it brings. And don't get me wrong, that's still very important. But what we're now seeing is companies looking at the employee experience, looking at the workplace transformation as a very important pillar of that digital transformation journey. Part of that requires them to look at the security model and new security. And I think security is evolving from a defend and detect model to a defend, detect, and response model. The ability to move quick and have agility and visibility into your operations is becoming really, really important today, and that's bleeding more into the telemetry and analytics, and over time, the automation space in the security market that I highlighted earlier. I think once that model is in place, you're going to see much more choice enablement, much more formalized choice for employees in terms of the apps that they want to use and the apps that you can provision and tolerate, but also control from a security point of view as well. And that will lead, that is another trend that we're going to see over the next 12 to 18 months. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is that shift around that legacy, end user computing devices state. We're going to see a much more of a formalized shift towards some of these modern systems that leverage the cloud, that addresses a lot of these things in front of it as well. What I would like to see from you guys as you walk away from here, and I want to leave you with 2 to 3 key high-level recommendations for your purposes. The first is that too often when I've spoken to companies, in terms of their legacy PC environment, they've kicked that can down the road for quite some time. And I think we're now starting to see companies now start to prioritize that, and address that, that legacy installed base. And so I think linked to that, and as part of that, you want to look at platforms that deliver a very good employee experience. Now I talk, you hear this term about employee experience quite often, but it's absolutely vital. In my opinion, I've seen so many digital workplace projects fail because they haven't fully considered that aspect right from the front. And I would say pay attention to 3 key areas. When we survey employees, we ask them, what are your frustrations with your devices that you use in the workplace? We hear 3 things constantly over the last 3 years. We want speed, we want reliability, and we want good connectivity. So pay attention to those 3 key areas and platforms that can address that. In our view, will absolutely determine success or failure. And then lastly, consider that flexibility, because that's really where the ROI is, and there's quite a lot of scalability advantages that can come when you look at a platform that can be deployed across a number of different use cases inside your organization. Coming back to that point about heterogeneity and choice, it's also about accompanying different use cases, whether that be shared devices, deploying it in kiosk facilities as well, because that's where you get scalability. So with that, I want to thank you.